Hello and welcome to Chroma. I'm Mark Lemon, and in association with Murphy's Magic, I'm here today to talk you through everything you've purchased and how to get the most out of it. So what is Chroma? Well, Chroma is a way of learning a colour that's been merely thought of by your spectator. And that's achieved under the guise of a really fun sort of test or experiment, however you want to present it. But at the end, not only will you know that colour, I'm going to show you ways to capitalise on that and appear to be reading your spectator's deepest thoughts and memories. So what have you received? Well, to be honest, it's a plastic card. There's not much else to it. I expect the packaging probably cost more to produce than the card. But this card's been really specifically designed, and there's many key features to it that are going to allow you to do this really easily, really simply, and without any memory work. So it's based on a Stroop test. And a Stroop test was a test that's credited to John Ridley Stroop, a professor that was studying human psychology, I think. And the idea of the test was that he was going to test the difference in speed between somebody being able to read colours printed in black ink, colours printed in different coloured inks, and then how quickly people could recount and tell him the colour of the ink rather than the colour that was printed in that ink, which sounds very confusing, and I think that was the idea of it. It was supposed to just test cognitive ability of his subjects. So I built a test around that, and I built this card that looks like something that maybe you'd pick up in a design museum or a science museum. And these choices of colours and the colours of ink they've been printed in are very specific and are going to allow you, under the guise of the test or the experiment that you're going to ask your spectator to go through, well, it's going to enable you to know the colour that they're thinking of without them telling you. It's based on a binary principle, and my first memories of the binary principle were actually from when I was a kid. I really got into magic seriously later on in my life, but when I was around 5 or 6 years of age, I remember receiving as a small birthday present a Paul Daniels effect, and it was this little plastic wallet, and it had some cards in it with many numbers, different numbers printed all over these cards. And I think there were all the numbers up to maybe 100. I can't remember what the exact range of these numbers were, but the idea was you had these 6 or 7, maybe 8 cards, and you'd ask somebody to look at a card and see if their number that they've chosen in their head is printed on that card. And they'd tell you, they'd go through each of them, telling you whether the number was on there, whether it wasn't on there. And at the end, you could use these cards, and with a process of addition, by adding up like the number in the top corner or something, you were able to reveal the person's thought of number. And I thought about that again recently. I'd say recently, about 3 or 4 years ago, I thought, well, what was the first trick that I actually learned? And that's the one that came to mind. And I could think back to that magic trick. And I thought, well, that's quite an interesting principle. I did some more research into it, and it's kind of commonly known as the binary principle. His were not very well disguised, although it was an interesting effect. I'm sure it was really sort of designed for kids, and hence I was like 5 or 6 years of age when I received it. But I thought it'd be really nice if there could be a justified way in which to achieve something similar. And I also wanted to streamline it down and reduce the number of props in play and kind of reduce the process and make the process seem justified as well. So that's when I came up with this. I'd always been interested in the Stroop tests and these colour cognition tests, and thought it'd be a really nice justification and reason to get your spectator to go through this process. So I'll get more into how to use the props in a minute, but that's basically the history of Stroop test as I understand it. There's a lot more information on the internet and on Wikipedia, for example. And that's also some history with Paul Daniels' trick that I did have many years ago. So I'll talk you through how this works. It works based on a binary principle, and that binary principle is going to tell you the colour they're thinking of merely by whether they can find it on the front of the card or the back of the card. So let's go over some labelling here. This is the side of the card that I'm calling the front. And the front is the one where in big letters it says Colour Cognition Test Card. Whilst the design of this might change slightly, it's going to look almost identical to this. This is not a final production one. The one you receive might look slightly different to this. So this side here is the front, the one with colour cognition test card written at the back. And this will be the back of the card. And it's the one with the black bar with some text at the bottom. So the back of the card is this one, front of the card is this one. And that's in relation to you, the one facing the camera. Front of the card here. And we're going to ask them to find their colour that they're thinking of, written in different coloured inks. And that's going to be a challenge for them. It's going to be kind of made to be a game, a test, an experiment. And we're going to time them while they're doing it. And the timing's completely irrelevant. It doesn't really matter. It's just a presentational piece. And it's justification of them going through this process. Because we're going to use the time that it takes them to finish the experiment as a kind of pseudo gauge as to how much of a cognitive colour or visually cognitive thinker that they are. And that's the way I justify it. You might find other justifications and presentations, but I use the timer and that works for me. So back to this binary principle, and binary principle we're going to be using is utilising a sum that we're going to be creating in our head. And that sum is either +1, +2, +4, and +8 to create this sum, depending on whether they find their colour on the front of the card or the back. So we're going to ask them to find their colour 4 times in total, once in black ink, once in blue ink, once in green ink, and finally in red ink. If they find their colour at any time on the front of this card, we're just going to add 0 to our total. We're not going to change our total at all. But anytime they find it on the back, that's where we're going to put that binary principle into play with the 1, 2, 4, and 8. So when we ask them to find their colour in black ink, if they find it on the back of the card in black ink, in our head we think +1. If they find their colour written on the back of the card in blue ink, that's +2. If they find it on the back in green ink, that's +4. And if they find it on the back in red ink, that's +8. So there's the 1, 2, 4, and 8, depending on where they find their colour in the ink that we've asked them to find it in. Anytime they find their colour written on the front, that's 0. The colour will only ever be on the front or the back in that colour independently. There won't be, for example, the colour brown written in black ink on both sides. It will only ever be on one side. But that's all the information you're going to need to know their exact colour. So that's black, blue, green and red. If you can't remember the order to ask those colours in, it's actually on the back of the card, the first 4 colours here are written in that order, in this first column on the left-hand side. Black, blue, green and red. I remember those colours because for me they were one of the very first electronic products that I bought was a Pro Mystic multi-dimensional colour cube. And that was the series of colours on the colour cube. So that's how I remember them, but they're in alphabetical order. So black, blue, green and red. Of those 4 colours, they're in alphabetical order there, which helps. So a little run through of an example would be, let's say they're thinking of the colour green. We don't know that at the time. We're going to say to them, in a minute, I'm going to ask you to get a colour in mind. Tell me when you've got one. And they say, yes, I've got one. Go, right, I'm going to hand you the card. When I do, I'm going to ask you to find your colour written in different coloured inks. So first of all, I'm going to hand it to you, tell you the ink colour to find it, and say go. As soon as you found it written in that coloured ink, bearing in mind there's 2 sides to this, so it could be on the back rather than the front. As soon as you find it, say yes. Give me an affirmation that you found it. I'm going to hand you the card now and start the timer. Find your card written in black ink. Go. And then I hand them the card. And now I have to watch to see whether they find it on the front of the card or whether they find it on the back of the card. And that's all I'm watching for. You could actually watch out of the corner of your eye and just see the rotation of the card if you don't want to appear to be paying too much attention to which side of the card they're on. But you just watch them. And in this example, they're thinking of the colour green and you say to them, find it in black ink, go. So now I'm watching them to see if they find it here. If they say yes, then I know that it's on this side of the card. But in this example with green, they won't find it on the front, they'll turn it to the back, and there I see it on the back in black ink. So they'll say yes. And immediately they say yes. I say, now find it in blue ink. And they'll look on this card. They will see it on the back as again now in blue ink. So I can see green here written in blue ink. So they'll say yes. So I've thought in my head that's +1 for them finding it in black ink on the back. Now they've found it in blue ink on the back. So that's +2. So in my head that's a total of 3. Now I say to them, find it written in green ink. And they'll look on the back. Then they'll turn it over to the front and they'll say yes, found it. And I say, and finally, find it written in red ink. And they'll say yes. And they'll find it in red ink on the front as well. So in that scenario, they found it on the back for black and they found it on the back for blue. So that's +1 and +2, which is the total of 3. Because the final two colours, green and red, they found on the front. So that was 0 and 0. So that tells me it's 3. That's the total at the end. And then if I look on the back, the third colour down is green. So I know that they were thinking of the colour green. So that's how this whole crib's built in. If you can just keep track of doing that sum in your head, the back of this card will tell you exactly what colour they're thinking of based on its position. Starting at the top colour here and working our way down the first column and then onto the second column from top to bottom. So in that example, green tells me 3, so it's in the third position. I'll run through another example now. So let's say they're thinking of the colour purple. So they're thinking of the colour purple. I say to them, okay, you've got a colour in mind. They say, yeah. You say, don't say it out loud. They haven't told you what the colour is. And you say to them, I'm going to hand you the card in a second and I'm going to start the timer. I'm going to tell you what colour to find your colour written in. So I'm going to tell you the colour of ink to find your colour written in. I know it sounds confusing. That's the idea of the stroop test. It's supposed to be confusing. So I'm going to hand you the card and I want you to find your colour written in black ink. Go. So they're going to look on the front for the colour purple written in black ink. And there it is on the back. So they're going to say yes. They're looking at the back. So in my head, that's +1 because they found it in the back, on the back in black ink. So +1. Now I'll say to them, find it in blue ink. And there it's going to look. And yes, so it's on the back. So it's there in blue ink on the back. So I know that's +2 in my head. So I'm thinking of 3 in total. That's +1 plus a +2. So that's 3 in total. So I'm up to 3 in total. Now I say find it in green ink. And they'll say yes, because they'll find it on the back here. So that's +4. So now I'm up to 7 because of the +1, the +2, the +4. I'm up to 7 in my head. And I'll say, and finally find it in red ink. And they'll say yes. And I stop the timer at exactly the point they say yes. And because they found it on the front, then I know that that's a +0. So I'm at the total of 7. So I know if I turn to the back of this card, the 7th colour down is going to be their colour. And if we have a look on the back here, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 is purple. So I know they were thinking of purple in that example. I've remembered that there are 7 in each column on here. So I would know instantly if I got 7, I'd just have to look at the very bottom colour in the first column. So that's how it works. I'll run through a couple of examples for you so you can stand with your card in front of you. And I'm going to think of a colour. I'm not going to tell you what it is. And I'm going to imagine that you've told me to go and you're telling me to find it in black ink. And I say yes. So I found it on the front in black ink. Now you tell me to find it in blue ink. I say yes. I found it on the back in blue ink. Now you're going to tell me to find it in green ink. And I say yes. I found that on the back as well in green ink. And finally you're going to tell me to find it in red ink. And I'm going to say yes, I found it on the front in red ink. So before I reveal, I'll give you a few seconds to work through that. But I found it on the front in black ink, on the back in blue ink, I found it on the back in green ink, and then I found it on the front in red ink. So that should have brought you to the total of 6. And then if we look on the back, if you count down to the 6th colour in the first column there, the answer is yellow. I was thinking of the colour yellow. So you could run through a few tests like this, but you'll find it works for all 13 of the first 13 colours that are written down here. I only cover 13 colours, and those are black, blue, green, red, white, yellow, purple, orange, brown, indigo, violet, grey and pink. So those are the 13 possible options. I couldn't really think of any other colours. There's not really any others that I've ever come across. Nobody's ever named a colour that's not been on here. I'll cover later what you can do if that does happen to you on a very rare occasion, but I have never experienced it. But that, in a nutshell, is how you learn the colour that they're thinking of. The timer's got nothing to do with it. As I said before, timer is just a presentational piece to make this seem like an experiment that's going to give you some specific information about how much of a visual thinker they are at the end. So I'll do one last run through with you. I've got a colour in mind now. I'm going to look for it in black ink, and yes, I found it. And that's on the front of the card that I found it. If I hold it up like this, so you can imagine that this is in reverse because I'm looking from this side. So I found my colour in black ink. Now I'm going to look for it in blue ink, and yes, found my colour. Now I'm going to look for it in green ink. Yes, I found my colour. And finally I'm going to look for it in red ink, and I found it. It stopped the timer. So in that example, if you were following along and you were paying attention, you'll see that I found it on the front for black, for blue and for green, and then I found it on the back for red. So that means that it's an 8 because it was 0, 0, 0 and then a +8 because I found it on the back in red. So the 8th colour down, which would be the first one in the second column with 7 colours being in each column. First one on the second column is orange. I was thinking of orange. So there's a couple of examples, there's a couple of run-throughs, but that's the strength with this card. And with the presentation of running through this test and using the timer, it's a completely justified process. At the end of it, you'll know a colour. So we'll look at ways in which you can reveal that colour a bit later, and we're also going to look at some other tips and hints on performing that basic version there. So a quick reiteration, this is the front of the card, this is the back, and the colours and sequence of those colours is on the back here. The first 13 colours written on the back by going top to bottom on the first column and then all the way down to pink on the second column on the back. I've personally memorised those colours, so I don't need to refer back to this to look at this crib to work out what their colour is. You can always just take the card back off of them and you could be holding it and you could sort of be referring to it as you're talking, and that would allow you to look down and count. But I would urge you to just memorise them. They're 13 colours. I memorised them based off of what I said earlier on the Pro Mystic product I had, which was the original multi-dimensional. And those colours were the first 6 on here, and they were in that order. And they're in alphabetical order, those first 6 colours: black, blue, green, red, white and yellow. So that's how I remember the first 6. And then I have this weird thing for remembering the rest. So I know down to yellow just because I was very familiar with performing with that Pro Mystic device several years ago. I then remember just the first letters here of the next colours. I remember POB, IV, GP. And for me, that kind of makes sense. POB was like a puppet, kind of children's puppet character on television in the 80s when I was a kid. So that's how I remember POB. And then the next is IV, GP. IV is like an IV. I've been in hospital myself and had to be on an IV, an intravenous. They call it an IV. It's like a fluids that they put in vascularly into you through your arm usually. So IV, and then GP is linked to that as well, because here the normal doctor that you would go to visit your sort of family doctor, not at a hospital, but at your local doctor's surgery, is called a GP. It stands for General Practitioner. So that's how I remember them. So I remember the first 6 colours: black, blue, green, red, white, yellow, and then I think POB, IV, GP. And that's how I remember them. And that's the first letter. The POB, IV, GP is the first letter of each of those colours after the first 6. So that's the remaining 7 colours, a POB, IV, GP. But it's up to you. You might find other ways. Maybe you might create a story, or there'll be some other mnemonic that you create that allows you to memorize them. But that's how I do it. You could even have it written down somewhere else. You could have it on the wallpaper on your phone, because you're going to use the timer anyway. So maybe after you've timed them and said how quickly they were able to do it, you could swipe up, close the timer application, and maybe you've got it written in your wallpaper behind. Or you could have it in your notes and you swipe up from the bottom, and the next available application that was previously open might be the notes, and you could have your crib on there. So there are many ways you can get it. Later on in this project, I'm going to teach you a method to do it using a shortcut. If you're an iPhone user and you have an iOS device, then I've written and created a shortcut that's going to allow you to very sneakily get their colour without having to do any memory work, or no work at all really, to be honest. So that's how I remember them, and that's how I would do the sequence. And I would really urge you to memorize these, because it makes performance so much better, so much cleaner. You could hand this off. You need to be nowhere near it. You just need to see out of the corner of your eye whether they're finding their colour on the front or the back of the card when they tell you they've found it. So that's the first tip that I can give you there, is to memorize these. A second tip is to use your fingers. So using your fingers, you can keep track of whether they found it on the front or the back. So I kind of think about my hand, starting it as open like this. And if they find their colour on the front, I'm just going to leave my hand as it is. If they find their colour on the back, I'm going to bend down that appropriate finger on the hand. So if we think about these, starting on your left hand, if you think about starting with black, then blue, then green, then red. So that would obviously be reversed from your side. So looking at your own hand, it goes like this: black, blue, green, and red. If they find it on the front, then I do nothing. If they find it on the back, then I fold that finger down. So I ask them to find it in black ink. If they find that on the back, I fold this finger down. If I ask them to find it in blue ink and they find it on the front, I leave that finger up. Then when I ask them to find it in green ink, say they find it on the back, bend that finger down. And then finally red, let's say they find it on the front, I leave it up. So in this situation, the only ones that they found on the back are black, and they found it in green. So that means it's 1 plus 4, so that's a total of 5. So I know it'll be the 5th card in the list, which I know to be white. So they're thinking of the colour white. I wouldn't hold your hand up like this while you're doing it. This is supposed to be something subtle that you would do at your side, and it doesn't have to be such an accentuated thing like that. You could literally just have it so you're just putting pressure with that finger, or when they find that colour, you're just putting some light pressure against your leg or something with the finger. So that's another tip for keeping track of it. That means that you can then do the sum afterwards. So maybe there's a point in the routine where you're revealing how many seconds they took to find all the colours, and that might be a nice justification and a good time for you while they're reacting to that to do the sum in your head. If you're going to repeat the effect or the test for multiple people in the same group, sometimes what I like to do is change the order of the colours in which I ask them to find their colour printed in. So normal sequence is black, blue, green and red, but sometimes I might say black, then red, then green, then blue. It doesn't really matter as long as you keep track of the correct addition to the sum based on the colour. You just doesn't mean you have to ask them in that order. So if you ask for black, red, blue and green, then obviously you'd be thinking +1, +8, +2, +4. So that's just, it's a nice touch just to do it in that order, because really the experiment that we're trying to portray here is about timing. It's an experiment in how quickly they can find their colour written in 4 different coloured inks. So in theory, asking them in any specific order wouldn't make a difference. So that's just a little thing, might throw people off a bit. But reality is they probably don't remember the order that you ask the colours in anyway. So it's just something that I end up doing. And even if you accidentally ask a colour out of order, you might realise immediately that you've done it and you've asked the wrong colour at that time. Well, just think in your head, it doesn't matter, I just have to change the number that I'm adding to the total. Remember at the start to make it clear to your spectator that there are colours printed on both sides of the card. Whilst it's not really important, because if they struggle to find it on one side of the card here at some point, you can say to them in the middle of the performance, oh, remember there are colours printed on both sides of the card. It's nicer if you say it ahead of time. Otherwise they're going to say, oh no, well I didn't realise that, so that time that you've got at the end there isn't accurate, that sort of thing. So it's easier just to go through that at the end and clear that up at the beginning. The other thing to check for at the beginning, it sounds silly and this isn't sarcastic in any way, but it's really important, is you kind of need to make sure the person's not colourblind before you start this. Otherwise, it's just not going to work. You're going to end up embarrassing that person. I wouldn't be embarrassed at asking somebody if they were colourblind, because ultimately it's probably more embarrassing for them for you to go into this experiment than it is to just be asked. I just literally say, oh, look, before we begin, you're not colourblind, are you? And that's fine. No, someone that's colourblind is not going to be offended by a question like that. So make sure that you've kind of squared that away first. Otherwise, you're going to be wasting your time and their time. I also like to get them to think of a colour and choose a colour in their mind without kind of showing them the colours that are on here. Because all those 13 colours kind of cover everything, I don't have any problem with them thinking of a colour rather than them finding a colour specifically on here. And the reason I don't want them to look on here and choose a colour is because I don't want them to have already found their colour printed in a specific coloured ink and remember where it is. I need them to definitively look on this card to find their colour, for them to give me that confirmation as to where they found it, so I can finally know whether I need to make any addition to my total in my head or not. So I tend to just say, you know what a stroop test is? Yeah, it's one of those tests where there are different colours written in different coloured ink. And at this point I sort of show them, I flash both sides of the card, and this is something that I picked up at a museum. It's just like a small test we can do to see how much of a visual thinker you are. And I've sort of flashed it, I've shown it to them, but I haven't left it with them. I haven't asked them to hold on to it at this point. I've just sort of shown them, just so we can familiarise ourselves with what a stroop test is, so that they know what it is, and it allows me to lead into my explanation about what a stroop test is. Now I'm going to ask them to just think of a colour. I just want you to get a colour in your mind. Yeah, tell me when you've got one. Okay, good. They're thinking of a colour, and now you say to them, all right, so here's the test. In a minute, I'm going to hand you the card and tell you what colour ink to find your colour written in. Sounds confusing, doesn't it? That's the idea. It's supposed to be confusing. So in a minute, I'm going to hand you the card, tell you the colour ink to find it in, and press start on the stopwatch. And I'm going to time you and see how quickly you can find your colour. And that's it. That's the script that I deliver. That's how I say it. At that point, I don't tell them they're going to be finding it in multiple different coloured inks. It's kind of nice to make that a bit of a surprise. They're almost on the back foot, and they didn't really expect this to come. So at that point, I just tell them, I'm going to tell you what colour ink to find it in. Find your colour written in black ink, go. And as soon as they find it, I say, and now find it written in blue ink, go. And that sort of thing. And I speak quite quickly when I say that, just to kind of put the pressure on, because it's quite entertaining for other people to watch and see somebody going, and sometimes they'll turn the card back, they won't find it straight away. And it's good, and it creates a lot of interest, and I do find that other people want to try this. From watching somebody do it, I have loads of people, 2, 3, 4 people in a group want to try it. They each want to see if they're better or faster than the previous person, which is quite fun. We'll get more into that in a minute about performing this with multiple people and different things you can do when I get onto the section about revealing the information. The last thing to be aware of that could go wrong is that they can't find their colour on there. Maybe they're thinking of an obscure kind of colour, like maybe turquoise, maroon, silver, gold, something like that isn't on here, that isn't included in those 13. If you get to the situation where you say to them, find it in black ink, go, and they look on here and they turn the card over. They're like, oh, it's not on there. And you just say, okay, well, let's start again. I'll stop the timer. I'll restart the timer. Now I want you to find choose one of those colors that you can see on the card there. Have you got one? Yes. Okay. And this is where I'll go into the routine from that point on. But a nice touch there would be not to say black ink on the first one. I'd just switch the blue and black around at that point, because they've probably already found it. They're expecting what to look for at that time, because you've already told them to find it in black ink. They couldn't find it when they were thinking of their obscure colour. Now they're choosing one of these colours. They might choose one that's already in black ink because they're trying to get ahead of the game. They're trying to look better than their friends. They're whatever. They're trying to beat the challenge. So I would at that point ask for it in blue ink, because that's going to mean they're going to have to look for it, which means you're on this side of it. They might not even remember where the orientation of the card is, where they did see it in black ink a few moments ago. So you're going to get the natural kind of response of them turning it to find their colour. So that's just a final sort of tip. If they do happen to not find their colour on there, then it could suggest that they are not thinking of a colour that's printed on the card. But it's never happened to me. Can't really think of many more. What did I say? Maroon, turquoise. I mean, I guess there's like cyan, magenta, silver, gold. But yeah, it's never going to happen. So I'm excited to be at what for me is probably the most interesting part of this project, and that's the reveals. And these are ways to capitalize on just knowing the color. So far, all we've really looked at is how you're going to learn that color and get the color that they were merely thinking of. I have showed you some justification in terms of using the timer, using the stopwatch on your phone to time them how quickly they can do it. Some other ideas there are maybe you could set a timer, so it's almost like you've given them a limit, like 60 seconds or something, and then the timer's counting down, and then you can stop the timer and see how many seconds they had left. So that kind of makes it seem like more of a challenge, more of a game, which is quite fun. The other thing, depending on your personality, how you want to reveal that. If you want to be nice, you could just reveal the colour straight up by saying, wow, 17.4 seconds, that's impressive. I've never seen anybody do it that quickly. I think from memory, the graph that came with this says that a above average intelligence person would take 17 to 18 seconds to be thinking of the colour green. And now you'll get the reaction from them because you name whatever colour that they were thinking of. So that's a nice way if you want to be complimentary. For me, I kind of would err on doing the opposite, but that's just because of my personality, and I'm quite kind of jokey and sometimes a bit rude with the people that I work with, just to get a laugh out of the rest of the group. And in that scenario, you stop the time and you say, wow, 17.4 seconds. That's slow. But if I remember the graph correctly, the graph says a grossly below average intelligence person would take between 17 and 18 seconds to think of the colour green. And now you just say nothing, you wait for their reaction, and then as soon as they react, they'll just be like, oh, and they're like that, and then all their friends will start laughing, and you can get a good laugh. It's a good gag that way. So those are really basic reveals there, but there's some more advanced ones that I'm going to go into now.